So, all right, we'll take a look at the solution. Won't do any code reading for the HTML, but we'll at least take a look. So we just have a few different elements here where we're practicing working with the different selectors. So we have, just an H1 element, a P element, it has an ID. We also have another P element that has a class. And then we also have an anchor tag, which has a couple different classes. So we have a few different ways of how we can query for these elements. We can query for their tag names, we can query for their IDs, we can query for their classes. So we'll see the various different ways that we query for things here. So we'll start off with some code reading. So Rukaya, I'm gonna have you do lines 1 through 4. Would you like any demos or reminders on how to read some JavaScript?
I'm gonna try it.
Awesome.
The query selector method with the argument h1 of the document object is being assigned to the variable $sign with heading.
I would just say the order. So I would say the query selector method of the document object is being called with one argument.
Okay, got it. Okay. That was on line 1, sorry. On line 3, the log object of the log method of the console object is being called with 2 arguments, a string and a variable. On line 4, the dir method of the console object is being called with 1 argument, a variable.
Perfect. Yep, nailed it. Trey, could you do 6 through 9, please?
So on line 6, we have, I'm sorry, the query selector method being called to the document object with the, I'm not sure how I would specify the explanation. I'm sorry.
1 argument.
Oh, with a string argument, with an argument of a string.
Mhm.
And then it's being assigned to the variable explanation.
Perfect.
And on line 8, we have the log method of the console object being called with 2 arguments, a string and a variable. And on line 9, we have the directory method of the console object being called with 1 argument, a variable.
Perfect. Thank you, Trey. Noah, could you do 11 through 14, please?
So the query selector of the document.
The query selector what?
The query selector of the
query selector.
The document object.
But what is a query selector?
The scrolling.
What is this referred to as?
What do you mean by this?
I'm using dot notation, which means what am I accessing?
Accessing document.
Document's the object. What am I accessing?
I'm accessing the element of the document.
It's not an element. What would be the difference between 12 and 11?
I'm not accessing anything.
You are. You're using dot notation. You're accessing something.
Yeah, but we are not referring to any of
You are. You're referring to what are inside of objects. Objects are collections of.
See, object are collection. Object is only 1 element.
But what is inside of an object?
There's like other properties.
Properties. So the query selector property of the document object. In this case, it's a method because it's being called. So the query selector method of the document object is being called with 1 argument, a string. If I were to do line 12, then it's the query selector or the query selector property of the document object. So is it a method? Is it being called? Or is it just being accessed? Is it a property? But very important that we specify what that is.
Uh-huh.
So let's give it another shot.
So the query selector property.
Method.
The method
Of the
of the document object
uh-huh.
is being called with 1 with int is the name of the class. which
With
is-
one
with one argument,
argument, yep, a string.
argument string and
Uh-huh.
assigned to a variable hint.
Yep.
Just question, so
Yep.
I notice we're using $, it's
I'll talk about it.
easier for the compiler to call it.
It's not for the compiler. I'll talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then 13 and 14.
The log method of the console object is being called with two arguments, one string and one variable.
Uh-huh.
And the direction, the dir
Uh-huh.
method
Uh-huh.
of the console object is being called with one argument.
Perfect. Yep, nailed it. On line 16, the query selector all method of the document object is being called with one argument, a string, and that is being assigned to the variable $paragraphs. On line 17, the log method of the console object will be called with two arguments, a string and the variable paragraphs. And then Caroline, 19 and 20.
Okay, on line 19, there's the query selector all method of the document object being called with one argument, a string that is being assigned to the constant variable links. On line 20, the log method of the console object is being called with two arguments, a string and the variable links.
Quiz question. Rukaya, why do we log things to the console?
So if we're logging variables, we get the values, and like we also log things for debugging purposes.
Yeah, so we can see the values of something. So if I'm working with a variable or something and I want to see what that value is, or what that variable is actually storing, I can log it so that I can actually see it. For debugging, so something's going wrong and I need to figure out where things are going wrong, why things are going wrong. So it just helps us whenever I want to see the data that I'm working with, know how to work with that data. That's where our console logs are very, very, very useful. Trey, can you tell me what is a model?
It's a structured representation of the web page or the HTML document.
Yeah, so in our case, that's what the model is yeah, it's a recreation of a web page, essentially. A model in general is just like a recreation of something. You know, it's like you have like model trains, and it's like a recreation of a train. Or in like 4th grade, if you ever had to like make those little like California for the different missions in California and to create like a little model for those, same thing. So when we say that something's a model, we're essentially saying it's a recreation of something. So in the case of the DOM, it's a recreation of our web page, but model by itself is just a recreation of something.
Well, what do you mean, like, kind of confused about the name, the recreation?
Like when I say create a model of something, you're recreating something that already exists, right?
Yeah.
So it's just like if I have like a model car, you know, so sometimes for like events or whatnot, they don't show the actual car, they show like a model car, right? It's like a recreation of what the actual car is, but it's just like a different interpretation. So that's all we're talking about is a model.
So I mean, like it's like we have an idea in our mind and then we represent.
It's like my Lego back there, right? Like I have an F1 Lego. That F1 Lego is not the F1 car itself. It's a model. It's a recreation of what the actual car is, of what it is. Yeah. Noah, which document is being referred to in the phrase document object model?
The document is the root document, which is the HTML document.
Yeah, exactly. So whatever document is being loaded or rendered by the page, which in our case is our HTML documents. But document is just referring to what page is being loaded or being rendered, in our case, our HTML page. Caroline, what does the word object refer to in the phrase document object model?
It refers to the way each part of the HTML document is represented as a programming object.
Exactly. So it's referring to how each element in HTML is recreated in the form of an object. So that in JavaScript, we have a way of working with it. So that when I'm working with the HTML element in JavaScript, I'm working with the object or the model of that HTML element. That's why the model is important. It's a recreation of the HTML element. I'm not necessarily working with the HTML element itself. I'm working with the object that is a model of the HTML element. Does that make sense?
Yes. Each element has its own model, but also that whole document is one model, so we have
Yes.
multiple models.
Yeah, so the document is
I
our
mean-
whole model, and it's made up of all of those objects. Those objects are modeling what the actual HTML elements are. Yeah, so it's like I cannot create an H1 tag in JavaScript, but I can create an H1 object, which would then get created into an H1 tag in HTML.
About that.
Yeah,
Huh?
Another question, the things that you showed me about, like, when the selector is called with nothing and then we call with element, you try to show, I think this, like, to explain to me something, but I don't know why I did not get it.
In the last Q&A, we were just talking about the
But when you show me selector with something and then selector with nothing, like, nothing is being called on no element and then with element.
no element in here.
Yeah, well, what you told me.
Oh, this is just JavaScript. So I'm just saying, and when I'm working with objects, objects have properties. So when we code read, whenever I see a dot, I'm working with an object. So I'm just saying for code reading purposes, I now know anything to the right of the dot is a property. Anything to the left of the dot would be an object.
Is it like similar to, I don't know, like the concept in my mind, we have for example, a class called document that it has properties, which are the functions or methods. Some of them is a query.
It is. Well, our objects or our classes, inside of that object, we
there's
have
a property.
properties or
Yeah,
we have
wow, thank you,
methods.
thank you very much. Yeah,
Mhm.
I kind of understand that.
Awesome. Rukaya, what is a DOM tree?
So the DOM is represented as a tree structure. So like the elements are like the branches of a tree.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a tree-like representation of all the HTML elements on a web page, where each element is represented as like a node in the tree, essentially. Trey, can you give me 2 examples of document methods that can retrieve a single element from the DOM?
I've got the query selector method
Mhm.
and the get element by ID method.
Yep, exactly. Those would be 2 different valid methods. So query selector is going to return one element, the first element that matched whatever the selector was. And then get element by ID, the same thing, obviously it's just only working with IDs, but those would be 2 different methods that would only return one element. Yep. Whereas in Noah, if I wanted to retrieve multiple elements from the DOM at once, what method can select multiple?
Yeah, it's query selector all.
Query selector all. Yeah, exactly. So if I use query selector all, then it'll actually select multiple elements that match the selector rather than only selecting one. Yeah.
And yeah, you're gonna show us example.
Yeah,
right?
yep. I'll show you an example. And we'll see it in action. Yep. Caroline, why might you want to assign the return value of a DOM query to a variable?
So to not overextend the, not to use it later on,
Mhm.
and so that the so it doesn't have to be queried, and so we do not take up too much.
Yeah, we don't have to keep doing it, yeah, essentially. Yeah, exactly. So by querying for the DOM and then saving it to a variable, I already have a reference to that element, so I can just keep using the variable. If I didn't save it to a variable, and let's say I wanted to access the like that button again or whatever, well then I would have to query for it again. And then if I wanted to access it again, I'd have to query for it again. So if I know that I need to reference an element multiple times in my application, I can just query for it once, save it to a variable, and anytime I ever work with that variable, it's always going to be storing that DOM element, so I can just keep working with it. DOM operations are quite costly. So if we think from like a performance standpoint, you want to try to minimize as many DOM operations as possible. I say that as in like, I don't want you to feel like you can't do any, like we need to work with the DOM, but you want to try to save as many as possible. So like a query selector, right? When I do a query selector, what's gonna do is it's gonna start at the root node or the top node, and it's gonna go search through the tree until it finds that element, right? So let's say I wanted to query for this H1. Well, if I didn't save it to a variable, and let's say I want to access the H1, but what do I need to do? I need to query for it. So I'm going to start at the top. Let me go find my H1. Okay, later on in my code, I need to query for the H1 again. What do I need to do? I need to query for it. So what do? I start at the top, I go through, I find it. I need to do it again. What do I need to do? I query for it. I started at the top, I go to the bottom. So forcing the browser to have to keep on searching and searching and searching. Whereas if I just did it once and saved it to a variable, I always have a reference to that element. So I saved myself the search of having to, think about like a loop, or if I have a loop, do I want to keep on looping, or do I just want to do it once? And then I can kind of save that result. So whenever we're doing query selectors or those kind of big DOM, we just want to make sure that we're trying to do it as efficient as possible. So that way we don't have to keep on calling. I think Rukaya, was it? What console method allows you to inspect the properties of a DOM element object?
So the dir method of the console object allows us to inspect the properties.
Yeah, so that dir method exactly will allow us to see everything that's inside. Yeah, no.
Yeah, this is what confused me. What the difference between the normal console log and the console dot?
I'll show you in a second. We'll talk about it in a second.
Why we are getting,
Yeah, I'll talk about it in a second. There's some weird quirks with it too, which I'll talk about and we'll point it out. So I'll get there in a second. Trey, why would a script tag need to be placed at the bottom of the HTML instead of at the top?
It needs to read or parse the entire HTML content before the JavaScript code can access it.
Exactly. So it needs to be able to parse through all of the HTML code first before the JavaScript can access it. So in a second, I'll go through and I'll showcase it and we'll see it in action. But if I run my JavaScript first, and if it tries to query for an H1, well, no H1 has been created yet because the JavaScript ran first. So I won't be able to find the H1 element. So that's why I need my HTML to be parsed and loaded first, and then my JavaScript. So that's why our script tags always go at the bottom of the HTML. So that way they get loaded and rendered last. But we'll take a look at that in a second as well. And then Noah, what does document.querySelector take as its argument, and what does it return?
it takes all the yeah, I noticed. Yeah, it takes all the elements in the document that match the name, the same name in the CSS. For example, like accessing, we have like we have many P's in the document. And so we access them through this, like, oh.
Yeah, so a CSS selector. So it takes a CSS selector as its argument, so that way it knows what element to target, essentially. So in our code right here, you can see I did hashtag explanation because this is how I target an ID in CSS. I did .hint because this is how I target a class in CSS. I did just P because this is how I target a P in CSS. So query selector takes a CSS selector as its argument. What element matches this CSS selector? And then what does it return? So what does query selector actually return?
So for example, for this one, returns if it's hint class, it returns the class and what properties inside it.
It returns the first element that matches this selector. So it's gonna go to the HTML, it's gonna find the first element that has the class of hint, which will be right here, and then it will return that object to us.
What do you mean by the word first?
First, so let's say right here, I had a P with a class of hint. And I had another one right here. So let's say I had two elements with the same class. Let's put our TypeScript side by side. So I technically have three because I have the further one down here, but I have these two, and then I have hint right here. So whenever I do a query selector only returns one element. I'm only ever going to get one back. If I needed to get multiple, I'd have to use query selector all. But since query selector is only going to return one, it's only going to return the first element that matches that selector. So since I'm querying for the class hint, it's going to find the first element that exists with that selector, which in this case is going to be this one, and it's going to return that one. It's going to completely ignore this one, and it's going to completely ignore this one. It's only going to find the first one. If this element didn't exist, well, then it would go and it would target that. So that's what I mean by first, is it's literally going to find the first element that matches that selector. Yeah.
So when we find all, for example, for selector all, is it gonna be, so we will be assigned all of them?
All of them.
In one variable?
Yes, I'll showcase it. We're gonna log in, we're gonna see it, but I'm gonna have an array essentially of all of them.
And then another question, so when we doing this, when the selector, when the query is happening, is it doing what I have said, right? Like it's selecting the class and its property, so we can manipulate the properties, for
It's
example.
not selecting the class and the property, it's selecting the object representation of that HTML element.
And what is inside it, right?
Would be all the properties and all the data.
Okay, so the object and its properties or the data
Yes.
inside.
Yes, exactly. Yep. So let's start opening this up. Yeah, Kayla?
John, is it okay if I ask
Uh-huh.
next door neighbors to turn down the air?
Oh, yeah, you can go, yeah. Turn it on, yep.
Yeah, the thing, yeah. Why do we have multiple time for the hint, like same class? So can I use it like, why did you create hint many times?
I was showing you what I meant by the first.
Yeah,
How query selector only returns the first element that matches.
but we can create like a same name, right?
Yep.
Oh,
That's what the whole CSS layout classes exercise. That's what that whole exercise was on. It was about reusing the same class and
sorry.
awesome. So if I console log the document, so when we refer to the document is just whatever document is currently being rendered by the browser. In our case, it's our HTML page. So when I log the document, you see it's literally logging my HTML. It has my doc type, it has my head. I can see everything's inside of the head. You can see I see all my styles and whatnot. So the document quite literally is our HTML document. What is currently being rendered by the page? This is what's being rendered by the page. It's this document right here. The dir method. So whenever we use the dir method will allow me to see the properties that exist inside of an object. So if I now put document inside of a console.dir, you can now see that the data has changed compared to what we saw. So when I log something, I'm logging the value of what that is. When I dir something, I'm logging the properties that make up that object. So you can see now when I do my console.dir document, it is showing me all of the properties that actually make up this document. We don't necessarily use all of these, but they can be beneficial as needed. So for instance, you can see I can get like the URL from here. So if I ever needed to access the URL, you can see that one of the ways that I can do that is via this. So I can do document.url, and that would give me the page URL. I don't have a background color, but if I did have a background color, you could access the background color from here. I could access the children or any child nodes. I could access any forms. So we later on this week, we'll be working with forms in JavaScript. And one of the ways that we can access it is via this, is we can do document.forms, and then all of our forms would appear here. If we had any images, you can see there'd be images here. So the document is just going to be information related to the document. Whenever you're working with an object and you want to see what ways you can work with that object, what properties it has, you can do a console.dir, and it'll always, I don't want to say always, but it usually will show you what's inside. Caveat with that is there's a weird quirk with the browser sometimes. So if I keep on, let's see if we get it. So right here, you see all of my consoles look the same. This is doing the same thing as this. There's a weird quirk with the browser where sometimes it will show your logs as DIRs, and it'll show your DIRs as logs. So it's, even though you are trying to do a console.log or you're trying to do a console.dir, sometimes it'll do the other. So you can see right now, it's doing them both as DIRs. You see I refreshed and now it fixed itself. And now it's doing the log and it's doing the dir. If I refresh, maybe it'll do, So it's kind of annoying. It's frustrating. You see sometimes it works with like some of them, sometimes it doesn't do the others. So if you're ever trying to do a .dir or you're trying to do a .log and it's not doing what you think it should be doing, just keep refreshing and it should eventually kick into action. You see like I've just done 8 different refreshes now and it still hasn't worked. But then now I got to 1 and now you can see this one's working, but it's not working for the ones up here. So it can be a little bit annoying, it can be a little bit frustrating, but it's just something to note with that is that it can be a little funky and showcase.
So can we do like a small example, like, because this one we're showing the body, right? Like this is the whole body or the whole document?
These are the individual elements on the page.
So you query select which one to show everything.
I query select the individual ones. So right here, I'm query selecting my H1.
And this is the console log. It's showing the value.
The console.log. Yep.
Showing the value inside the variable.
Yep. So right here. So I queried for an H1. I then logged that variable, and then I did a dir on that variable. So right here is my log. What is the current value of heading? This is the value, but heading is an object. What is inside the object? Oh, here's inside the object. Here are all the properties.
But where are the values?
Oh, right here. So here are all the properties. So for instance, this H1 has text content, right? It says example domain. So H1, let's find text content. There we go. H1.text content, example domain. And we can see the text content right there. So when we do, this is why dir is very useful because it allows me to see all the data that makes up that element. So now I can see what text this element has. I could see what classes this element has. So if I had any classes, I could be able to see those. If I had any IDs, I'd be able to see those IDs. So I can see all information that this element has all right here. I can see who its parent is. We can see who its children are. Any questions about the logs versus dirs? Why are we using a log? Why are we using a dir?
Another example, why the attribute when we try to console log, the attribute is giving us null?
Which one?
The explanation.
Where does it say no?
Oh, why mine is giving null?
Then you got your query selector on,
That's it.
which is something I'll talk about in a second. We'll showcase it. Trey?
Mine's not really a question so much, but I just want to say thank you for showing that quirk because that happened to me and I thought I messed up. So thanks.
Yeah, of course, it happens. Yeah, I'm not sure why, and it's very frustrating, but yeah, it's a.
I need to put the hashtag because it's an ID.
Exactly.
If it's class has to be dot, if it's
Exactly.
element.
Exactly, it takes a CSS selector. Which, you bring up a good point, which we were talking about in the Q&A. One of the quiz questions was, why does our script tag need to go at the bottom of the body? Why can't it go anywhere else? So right now, our script tag's at the bottom, right? Watch what happens if I move my script tag to the top. So let's put it at the start of the body. So usually a script tag is at the bottom. We've now put it at the top. Get all the data that I got back. Null, 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 null. So why would these be null? Well, what am I trying to do? I'm querying for an H1. Okay. Well, what is the first thing that gets loaded on my HTML on line 40?
The script.
The script tag. So before it ever even rendered the H1 on line 43, what is it going to do? It's going to go into my JavaScript file on line 40. And then it's going to start executing all the code in my JavaScript. And in my JavaScript, what do I try to do? I'm trying to query for an H1. Well, my H1 doesn't exist yet. My H1's down here. As soon as I move my H1, and if I were to put it above, then now you can see that that one worked. Because the H1 got rendered before my script tag ran, but the other one still didn't. This is why our script tags always go at the bottom of our body, because we want to make sure all of our HTML has gotten rendered and parsed, so that then if I need to work with it inside of our JavaScript, I'm able to do so. Any questions about that? Which is why also a good thing to point out, Noah, why you're getting null. If a query selector cannot find an element that matches that selector, it's going to return null. So if you ever do a query selector and you're getting null back, that means that there is no element that matches that selector. Meaning in this case, there's no element that had the ID of explanation. Or in this case, there's no element that is an H1 or whatever. So if it can't find it, it's going to return null. Rukaya?
So why can't we link our JavaScript file like our CSS file at the head?
Well, our head gets loaded before our body. So you wouldn't want to do it in the head because we'd still end up with the same issue where your head is going to get rendered first before your body, so we'd still end up with the same issue. At CSS, it doesn't necessarily matter because the CSS doesn't actually get executed until the browser actually gets rendered and it renders the document. So then it's still able to apply those styles because then the elements would already have existed. But since our JavaScript needs the HTML to be rendered first, that's why the JavaScript has to become last.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering about the HTML collection.
Yeah. So I'll talk about that in a second. Let me just touch on one other thing, and then we'll talk about the collection. So the $signs, no functionality purpose. There's no reason to include them to not. It's just like a coding style. It's just for clarity. A lot of writing code is obviously writing code to functionally get done whatever it is that you want to get done. But you also want your code to be readable and easy to work with. So this is like a code style that we use. And so the $sign, what it means is you're just storing some sort of a DOM object. So anytime you're ever storing a DOM object, you queried for an element, you accessed an HTML element, whatever it is, that's all that $sign is symbolizing. So now I know that as soon as I see this variable right here on 6 with the $sign, before I even go to log it or anything, I already know it's going to be storing some sort of a DOM object. I may not know what, I may not know what element or whatnot, I may not know what's inside, but I know it's some sort of a DOM object. So just by the name of the variable, I already know in certain ways of how I need to work with it. It's a DOM object. I already know certain properties that I can or cannot use. So it's just the coding convention. There's no functional purpose for you to have to include the dollar signs. You can include them, you can drop them, whatever it is that you want. But I think, and I hope that you'll agree with me, that I think that over time, it's a nice little just kind of code style to help yourself out in the long run. Or if other people read your code or you need to read other people's code, just a nice visual way to know what it's going to be storing without you even needing to kind of log with it and work with it. Any questions about the dollar sign and why we did that?
Yeah,
Huh?
I noticed that on the compiler when you try to recall the name, or when you want to put console log. So you put dollar sign, it's gonna show you the options, you have explanation. You have like other variable names you have created.
In the console, you're saying?
Yeah, so when you click dollar sign,
Yeah.
it's easier to see the values, you see it like
When I do dollar sign, this is showing me all the variables that I have.
with dollar sign,
With
which
dollar
is
sign.
easier to defer from other variables.
Okay, it's, yeah, I guess I never
That
even know that
wasn't
too,
first.
but yeah, I think dollar signs technically, isn't that also like a bash thing? Where like, like in the terminal or your shell is usually like signified by like a dollar sign. So like if you ever gone to like a
Sometimes,
documentation,
Yeah.
it'll say like
Yeah.
dollar sign and like get switched or
yeah,
whatever.
it's
like,
just convention though.
yeah.
What's the difference between console.log and console.dir?
Anyone want to be able to tell Robert what's the difference between a log and dir?
The console log shows the values and the dir shows the properties of the object.
I hear the words, I don't understand.
Yeah, I know, for the console log, it shows the actual value in HTML file. Like for example, in HTML file, when you put H, it shows you the actual H and what is inside it. But when you do dir, yeah, this one kind of confused me. It shows like a lot of properties inside it. But if you search in it, you can see like a lot of.
So which is which?
So between all of these, what would be my logs and what would be my dirs?
The log is the console log, is it shows the actual value in
the
HTML
first
file.
one.
So this
First.
one, and then,
But the second one, it only shows the object itself.
If you open it. But I thought if I logged an object, it opened like that as
so
well.
that's what I was gonna check. So what if I just had a normal object? So let's say,
Yeah,
and then let's say if I did a,
Picture.
oh. Okay, so let's just say I create a normal object, and then I logged it, and then I dir'd it. Why is it not showing?
Because it's not, we didn't query for it,
I didn't query for what?
for the object. No, that's just it.
should
It's
be
not
there.
an HTML object.
Yes, it should be there, so why?
Should it be there?
Yeah, why? You just refresh it.
What did I just write? What language?
You're using TypeScript. Are you using the command, the TSC, npx TSC?
I need to
Oh.
compile my code. What is this? DOM querying? Querying solution.
Yeah, oh, you need to run it, yeah.
I need to compile. Yep,
Compile it, and then now you can see the object, yeah, it's supposed to be there.
that's my object.
Object, okay, the first thing.
But I think in what Noah is still technically right in this, where the log is logging the value. So you can see my log right here is still printing out the current value of what that object is storing. Whereas in dir is only showing me the properties inside. So objects, in this case, this is a browser where as soon as I click it, it'll go fetch the most recent up-to-date version of the object, and I can still view it from here. But in theory, the logs are the only ones that are printed out right there, so it's printing out the current value.
And
Okay.
You disagree with that?
I don't know.
But it's true, because watch, so if
I
I
actually don't know the difference.
but if I watch, if I delete person.first name,
Uh-huh.
and then let's console log person again. But actually, I don't even need to console log person again. You can see right here, right? It shows first name Sean,
Uh-huh.
first name's gone. Because what happens is when you click on the arrow, it fetches the most
fetches
recent
the
up-to-date
current
version.
value.
Yeah.
Whereas object or
Whereas in
dir will just log what it was. No,
dir, it's still the same thing, but the dir, it never prints the current value. So I'm getting the current value as soon as I click on like the arrow. But that's why at least when I do my log on the heading, I can see the H1 right here, because that's the current value of what it exists. But I can't see the actual properties on a DOM object unless I dir it.
huh. Oh, you can't actually see the, well, but in the explanation, you can see it.
In this case, I can't, it's just showing me children, showing me the text. Yeah.
I see, so the behavior is very different for node objects.
Yeah, no, yeah,
For
specifically.
DOM
Yeah,
objects, okay.
yeah.
Huh. Interesting.
so,
Uh-huh.
well, when you deleted, the code, you did, can I say it again? When you deleted?
I deleted the property.
So I deleted property, which is the first name, and since you deleted it, you can see the most recent one,
It doesn't exist
the updated object, because object is get like.
because it got deleted. This is back in week 1 when we talked about how objects are reference data types, and we're not actually storing the data, but we're storing a pointer to where that data exists inside of memory. So when I click this little arrow, it's fetching the most recent version of that object in memory. And what happened in that object? I deleted the property, which is why I cannot see the property right here. Whereas then if I were to undo that, you can see now it's still showing me the property. Uh-huh.
So, yeah, it kind of confused me as Robert, you mentioned like that, the dir, I don't know why I feel like that. So the console log shows the value, okay, we can see the
Yeah.
value of the. You can see the H1 example, this is the actual
Yep.
value in HTML
Yep.
document. But the dir, when you go to, what, yeah.
You had how you explained it was correct. Your log will log the current value of that variable.
But dir,
Dir will log the properties that make up.
properties makes up. Like, for example, for,
So right here, I'm doing a log for the person. So it's logging the
That-
current state of this variable, which is this object. Right here, I'm doing a console.dir. So I'm not logging the value of the person object.
it's first.
I'm logging to see what properties are inside of the object. Which in, oh, this one, oh, it's because well, it is true, there are no other properties inside. But if there were more properties, like in our node list, then we would see more of them.
For example, in H1.
Yep.
So if you go to the, oh, what it calls, for H1.
Yep.
The dir. Well, what dir stands for?
I think directory,
Directory.
yeah.
So the directory can see the directory of properties that.
It's kind of like a table of contents, you know, it's like you open up a book or like something and you have like the table of contents and it's saying here's inside and here's like what page. It's kind of like what this dir is doing. What's inside the object? Here's all like the different data that's inside that object. So the dir is just kind of letting me see almost like the table of contents of that object. What is everything inside this book? What is everything inside of this object?
So I went to the, for example, for explanation.
Uh-huh.
If you see the dir or the directory, you can see access key align. So is this the CSS properties we can use?
These aren't CSS properties, these are JavaScript properties.
Oh, so why the console is showing? Is it like the one we can use on this?
Which one?
So the console shows, or JavaScript showing all
This
the.
is showing every single property that exists on DOM elements. Anytime I've ever working with a p tag, anytime I'm ever working with a button, anytime I'm ever working with a div, these are the properties that will exist on every single DOM object. So this is just showing you all of the properties that exist on that object. It's just helpful to know, like, how to work with things. For instance, I have an element. I need to access that element's sibling. Well, I don't know how to find its sibling, but what would I do? I would console.dir the element that I do have, and I would see what properties are available to me to help me figure out to accomplish what I need to. So if I needed to find a sibling element, well, what I would do is I would do a console.dir, and then I would look to see if anything here could help me. I want to find a sibling. Let me see if there's anything here that has anything related to siblings. Okay, I'm going. I see children. Those are children. They're not siblings. Ah, right here. Next element sibling or next sibling. So now I see, oh, I have two properties that I may be able to use to help me out. Or maybe I want to figure out who the parent is of this element. Well, let me see if there's any properties here that could help me out. Oh, there's a parent element property. I could probably use that. Oh, there's another sibling one. There's previous. So it's just, if I need to do something with an object and I don't know everything that's available to me, I'm going to console.dir and I'm going to see all the information that I have available to me. So I now know how to work with it. I can see the tab index. I can see the tag name. So I can see a whole bunch of information about it. And then we'll get to the HTML collection. Before I do, are there any other questions that anyone had so far? Okay. When we did a query selector all, so we talked about the difference between query selector and query selector all, right? Query selector is going to return one element. So in this case, when I did a query selector for my H1 or a query selector for my P tag, it returned one element. It returned the first H1 or the first P tag that matched that selector. When I do query selector all, it's going to return something called a node list. And there'll be a node list of all of them. So you can see right here, paragraphs, you can see it says node list 3, and then I open that up. What does this look like?
This looks like an array.
Looks like an array, right? Hello? Essentially is an array. So you can think about a node list, think about like an array. So if you ever wanted to loop over an array, you could also loop over a node list. So if you ever had a collection of P elements, I wanted to loop over them and I wanted to change every P element's text or something, I could do that. So a node list is a collection of all of the elements that match that selector. So I want to select all P elements. So now I have a node list of all of our P elements. Now this is a node list. There's something technically also called an HTML collection. So let's say instead of query selector all, I did get elements by tag name. So const paragraphs. Let me just copy this. Paragraphs 2. Get elements by tag name. And then let's log paragraphs 2.
So we don't put tag symbol.
As
Let me just make sure I got that. Okay. Sorry, what were you saying?
Well, we don't put a tag symbol because.
Tag symbol. What do you mean by tag?
It's not an ID, right? So tag is just.
No, so I'm saying tag name. So what is the actual element name?
It's the
P, button,
P, yeah,
HTML, or
There's-
whatever it
it's
is.
not a class or ID.
Yeah, exactly. But now I'm using two different methods. I'm using query selector all, and I'm using get elements by tag name. So now you can see that my first paragraphs, this is query selector all, is a node list. The second one, which is get elements by class name, is an HTML collection. We'll open them up.
by tag name, right?
Yes, yep, yeah. So whenever you do any of these
Get
get elements, they always return HTML collections.
Oh,
Query selectors always return node lists. Okay, but they look the exact same, right? They're indexed numerically, they have a length. This one has a property, but there is one difference. I go to a code pen that I had.
So you said tag is the same as all?
They're not the same. One is a node list and one is an HTML collection. They're kind of the same. They look the same, but there's one functionality difference. Okay, so let's say I had this. Let's say I had a UL, and inside of that UL, there were 3 LIs. Okay. I then queried for my UL, and I got all of the LIs in 2 different ways. I did one via query selector all, which we just learned is a node list, and I did one as a get elements by class name. So now if we look at my first console log, I have 2 different ones. The first one, which was get elements by class name, is a collection. So I have my 3 objects right here. The second one was my query selector all, which is my node list, which is all of my LIs right. Makes sense so far? I have 3 LIs. I've now queried for all of them, and I now have 2 different ways of how we're accessing it.
So the
Mhm.
So the first one returned by querying for the class name and returned basically a properties with objects. Oh no, it returned just objects and then the node, okay.
This returned an array or an HTML collection of DOM objects.
Mm,
This returned an array or node list of DOM objects.
okay.
Yeah, as you mentioned, so, okay, so this is why we learned about object, because if it's class name, it's gonna be object, so we're gonna work
Now,
with.
we're still always working with objects. The only thing that changes here is a node list versus an HTML collection.
Because I can see over there as an object, and I can see down there as an
But
array.
those are referring to the LIs. Get elements by class name is a node list of objects. Query selector all is a node list of objects. Get elements by class name is an HTML collection of DOM objects, just like how I showed in our last example. Paragraphs is an array, a node list of DOM objects. My P hint, my P explanation. Get elements by class name is an HTML collection of DOM objects. They are still storing DOM objects, but they are an array of objects.
The HTML collection is an array of objects.
Both
It's-
are node list and HTML collection. There's one difference which I haven't been able to get to yet. There's only one difference between them, but they're both just arrays. The only difference is an HTML collection is live. So
Live,
yes, let's say I added a new element. So I had only 3 LIs, and let's say that I created a new LI. Well, if we look at my console log. Why does this keep resetting? Why can't we just move you? Why do you keep? Can I move this somewhere else?
it's an HTML collection.
I want to.
You need that for body.
There we go. Okay. Let me clear these. Let's run it again. Okay. So the first one, this is before I created any LIs. You can see my HTML collection only has 3 objects because there were only 3 LIs. My node list only has 3 LIs. However, after I created the LI, you can see that my HTML collection now has a 4th object where the node list still only has 3. It's the only difference between the two. An HTML collection is live, meaning if I dynamically add more elements, my original variable will be updated with those new elements. A node list will not. So if I wanted to essentially be able to access a new node list with the new LI element that I just created, I would have to query again. I would have to do another query selector all to be able to see the new one. Right now, it's still only showing 3. As soon as I were to query for the element again, then it would show 4 objects inside. It's the only difference between them. Other than that, you can think about them as the exact same. They're just essentially arrays of DOM objects. The only difference is one will see new objects as they get created, where the other, you would have to requery the DOM again to get the new objects. So I'm gonna get the tray and then I'll get to you. Tray.
When would you use each preference?
It's like one of those things where I teach you guys the differences of all of this, and then I've never used a collection once. So for me, like, it's so much of programming is so opinions and like opinionated. So like, for instance, like some people don't like query selector because they see query selector as kind of like a Swiss Army knife. Like it doesn't have one purpose. It's kind of like multi-purpose. It can be used with tags, whereas it can be used with classes, whereas it can be used with IDs, where it can be used with super crazy CSS selectors. And some people prefer these methods because it's more specific. I'm getting you by a tag. I'm getting you by a class. I'm getting you by an ID. So a lot of that comes more into your preference of like how you like to structure your code and readability. From a functional standpoint, I've never really ever found myself in a situation functionally where I've needed to use that aspect of an HTML collection. So far, I haven't been at a point where I'm like, oh, I really wish, or I really need this to be an HTML collection because I need to see that new DOM object. It's just anything that I've built so far, I just haven't necessarily come across it. So me personally, I usually go the node list way, and I usually just use query selector and query selector all. That's just a me preference thing. But in theory, you could use the other ones. I wouldn't say that there's ever gonna be, you would set yourself up in like a bad spot by like using one. There may be a situation at one point where you may find yourself needing to use that live aspect of the HTML collection, like I just pointed out. But as of my experience so far, I haven't run into it. Eventually, you're gonna be learning about React once you get to the senior side. And you're gonna completely ignore everything we're talking about related to the DOM because they have their whole way of handling other stuff anyway. So if you write the majority of your front-end code for the rest of your career in React anyway, then that's also something that you don't necessarily worry about. Because in React, you don't work with the DOM, you work with something called a virtual DOM. So you'll learn more about that on the senior side.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. And Noah, did you show the question?
Yeah, guys, about the tag name and so the node list, list is for the node list never change, which is for the selector all.
Yes.
And for the selector by tag name
Yep.
or the class name
Yep.
or ID
Yep.
is live.
Yep.
So it keeps like it's dynamically changing.
Yeah.
As you showed it.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So since this was a query selector all right here, P tag, if I wanted to, so let's say like I added another P element inside of here, in order for me to access it again, I would have to do another query selector all to get the new one. Whereas in the HTML collection, if I would have done this as a get elements by tag name, it would have already updated for me. I wouldn't have to query again, essentially.
And my question is to you, why did you said you prefer using query select all, or what's your perspective? Is it because you don't want to change your program? Like,
3 ways. One, it's what I learned. So it's what I like, it's how I built most of my experience with. So it's kind of what I got the most comfortable with. So it's like kind of how I learned. So it's like kind of not pigeonholed me, but it's like made it feel like home because it's like how I know how to work with it. 2, I like the flexibility aspect of it, where like I don't have to change my whole method just to like change what selector I want to use. Like maybe I initially did it by a class and I'm like, oh, I don't want to do a class anymore. I want to do a tag name or whatever it is. I don't have to change my whole method. I just need to change the selector. And another cool thing is that query selector takes any valid CSS selector. So any valid CSS selector. So I could do something like, so now this would select all div elements with a class of test that are a direct child to a P tag. So I like query selector. I mean, I try to avoid doing crazy stuff like this anyway, because I feel like it's just kind of hard to figure it out. But if you ever needed to, you could find kind of complex elements of where they appear in the DOM by changing your CSS selector, because any valid CSS selector will work. So as long as whatever your CSS selector is, as long as it can find an element, it'll select that one. So that's why I like query selector, because if I needed to, I can just change whatever selector it is, and I know it'll always try to find the element. I don't need to change the whole method I'm using to be able to access the element.
But the thing is, we have a drawback, if you change something is.
That's only when I do query selector all. So that's only when I have a node list. So whenever I have multiple. If I'm just working with one, doesn't matter. It's only when I'm selecting all or multiple.
And in your code, for example, do you use any?
No, I've never used, I haven't found myself in a case where I've cared about that live aspect of it. I just haven't ran into it. It's not to say that I won't. It's not to say that there's, a good use case for it. For me, as far as I've written code so far, I haven't ran into that situation. So I haven't needed to account for that live aspect.
I mean, for all query selector.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm saying. I haven't ran into like that where I've needed that. So that's why I haven't used HTML, any of those other methods, because everything that I've done so far, I've been able to get by with query selector all and query selector. So if it ain't broke, why fix it? Caroline?
Yes, I just had a quick question. I don't know if it's related to this, but or TypeScript,
Huh?
because I remember that we were querying with TypeScript as form control elements or as HTML collection.
Yep.
Or why is it that?
So we'll talk more about those as we get into the other exercises, but so on line 1, what am I querying for on line 1?
For the H1.
H1 element, right? So when I hover over it,
Oh.
what is the type?
HTML heading element.
Okay, or null, because maybe it doesn't exist, right? What am I querying for on line 6?
HTML ID element.
So this is the hashtag means ID, right? So I'm querying for an ID. Do I know what element it is? Right? I know it's an element. I don't know what kind of element. Is it a P element? Is it a form element? Is it a div element? Is it a whatever? So I don't want to spend too much time on it right now. We'll talk more about it as we come across it. But that's why we need to do that asserting and whatnot. Because if I need to, there's certain properties that only exist on certain elements. So like forms, right? There's certain properties that only exist on forms. So if I'm querying for an ID, but I know that this is going to be a form, well, in order to tell TypeScript that this is going to be a form, that's where I would have to do that add. So now if I did HTML form element, well, now you can see the explanation. TypeScript knows it will be a form. So we'll talk more about that as we come across it as we need, but that's why we have to do it.
Thank you.
Wow.
But we went a little bit over. It's lunchtime now. Any final questions before we wrap it up and go get some food?
This is really important.
Very.
This one.
So this is why I was saying like week 1, like objects are very important to JavaScript. Like, and it's like new programmers really struggle with objects. But I'm telling you, the more comfortable you get with objects, and the easier you get, like you just get more comfortable with objects. JavaScript just feels so much easier. It's so much easier to wrap your head around. You know how to work with different things. But very important because JavaScript literally is all objects. Rakaya?
So we have the get element by class name,
Mhm.
but we don't have a get element by tag name, right?
I think there is.
Is
Get element by tag name. Yep.
that's elements.
Oh, get elements. Yeah, I get what you're saying. Get
Mhm.
element by ID, get element by name, get element. Yeah, maybe there isn't. Let's see. Get element. Yeah, probably not. So it seems like even if you only wanted to get one element anyway, you're kind of locked into using the query selector because it doesn't even seem like they have kind of get element equivalent.
Got it. Thanks.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Any other questions?
We had to, but
Alright, stop the share, stop the recording.